Good afternoon and welcome to the second of a three-part webinar series on establishing successful pollinator habitat in solar projects. My name is Charles Gould and I am an extension educator with Michigan State University Extension, and I am the moderator for today's webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted as soon as the closed captioning is completed. At the completion of this webinar, a survey will pop up on your screen. And I would respectfully ask that you take just a few minutes and fill that out. There's 7 questions, and this is how we determine, that's how we measure impact, and it's really critical to our work as extension educators. I'd like to briefly explain the purpose for these webinars. In Michigan, we have what's called the Farmland and Open Space Preservation Program, more commonly referred to as PA 116. This program is designed to preserve farmland and open spaces and offers tax relief to farmers who voluntarily participate in temporary farmland preservation agreements. This program is administered by the Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. PA 116 was amended to include solar projects with the stipulation, and I quote, "The owner agrees to plant a cover crop, including pollinator habitat, under the solar panels to reduce erosion and to maintain soil fertility. Farmers who sign a solar lease agreement cannot claim the tax credits during the time the land is being used to produce solar power." Since PA 116 was amended, there have been many questions as to what it means to establish a pollinator habitat in a solar project in Michigan. The webinar last Tuesday, which you see on the screen, and the virtual field day today, and next Tuesday's webinar on maintaining a pollinator habitat in solar projects are efforts to provide clear answers to those questions. Today we'll be taking you on a virtual tour of pollinator habitat sites on 3 solar projects. All 3 sites are in Minnesota because we don't have suitable sites here in Michigan, at least not yet. However, there's much we can learn from each of the sites that's applicable to Michigan. Next slide. So before we begin our virtual field day, there's 2 key points that I want to bring up. At least I'd like to frame the concepts you're going to learn today in 2 ways. And this is the first one. The role of the Michigan Pollinator Habitat Scorecard for solar sites in establishing a successful pollinator planting. The scorecard was developed by the MSU Department of Entomology to guide vegetation management at solar installations to make them more supportive of native pollinators. Solar projects going in on land enrolled in PA 116 either meet this or they don't meet this. And again, this is the reason why we're having these webinars. What we would hope is that pollinator habitats would go in projects that are outside of PA 116. And those projects would also use this scorecard. What we'd really like to see is seed companies offer mixes that meet the requirements for this scorecard. Next slide. The second concept that I want to bring out here is the potential role that solar projects have in food security. And the bullet points that you see here on the screen are from a recent research report that was done by researchers across the United States and in Canada. And I've got some of the key points listed there on the screen. As you know, most of the world's crops depend on pollinators, so declines in both managed and wild bees raise concerns about food security. However, the degree to which insect pollination is actually limiting current crop production is poorly understood, as is the role of wild species as opposed to managed honeybees in pollinating crops, particularly in intensive production areas. So this nationwide study was conducted, and here are some of the key points that I think are relevant to our discussion today. So circling back to the comment I made earlier, so what was not well understood is the contribution of wild bees to pollinating crops. This study found that they play a significant role in pollinating crops. And so I would submit that projects can play is when they are strategically located in proximity to crops that rely on pollinating insects, they play an important role in maintaining and strengthening those wild bee populations. So that didn't, you know, this context, this concept is my, my opinion, is not necessarily put across in this study. But when we put solar projects that have pollinator habitat in them that will support the wild bee and wild pollinating insect populations, then I think that we see those benefits that are pointed out here in this study. Next slide. So our content expert today is Rob Davis. As director of the Center for Pollinators in Energy, Fresh Energy, Rob helps accelerate the nation's transition to use of clean and renewable energy. Rob's work in pollinator-friendly solar has been featured in trainings by the U.S. Department of the Interior's National Conservation Training Center, the U.S. Department of Energy, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. In feature stories such as Fast Company, Scientific American, and Foodprint, and a talk titled "This Unlikely 1960s Space Tech Can Help Save the Bees" on TED.com. Previously, Rob helped launch technology startups and created the international crowdsource campaign that launched the Firefox web browser. So Rob, I'd like to turn the floor over to you. The time is now yours. Thanks for participating in this virtual field day today.
Thanks so much, Charles. Really appreciate the invitation. Really appreciate the opportunity to be with you and be with everyone on the call today. And certainly really warmly appreciate everyone making time for such an important and timely conversation coming back from a long weekend. So I understand that your email boxes are absolutely jam-packed. We want to make sure that you have, productive and actionable tools to be able to take away from today's conversation and presentation. We really look forward to your questions. If you could use the Q&A function of the Zoom field here, we will get to those toward the end. I'm going to go ahead and share some screen. What's going on here today is I'm going to provide a little context, but then also tell you the story of solar on arable and prime and productive farmland. So I'm going to start, and we're going to visit a couple of different solar projects around the country. So I'm just on Google Maps here, and this is near in Chisago County, Minnesota, and in near Forest Lake. We're immediately south of the North Star Solar Project, 100 megawatt solar project right at the spot where Canadian hydropower interconnects to this substation for Xcel Energy, and just north of Chisago Solar Farm, owned and operated by Enel Green Power. So the Chisago Solar Facility here is this site is one of 16 locations around the state of Minnesota, totaling 150 megawatt project. So since these projects have been in the ground, seeded and completed for going on 2 or 3 growing seasons now, we want to be able to welcome you to see exactly how this happens, what this looks like in terms of the development, the completion, the seeding, and how it changes over time. So maybe first though, I'm going to shift to provide a little bit more information and context. So the three things I'm going to shift between in this presentation are going to be PowerPoint, maps, and my own iPhoto library. So I appreciate your patience as we kind of navigate between three things. But Fresh Energy, we're a nonprofit energy policy organization. We work to advance best practices in terms of the clean energy transition. We know that because solar got its start in the desert Southwest, that the practices seen here on this project, I believe in California, made their way over the Rockies and are used on a number of different projects. For example, this one in Georgia, where you can see arable farmland right outside the fence, and yet they trucked in tons and tons of Class 5 gravel, it looks like. And this project in Ohio, where they similarly, built it with the mindset of a substation or an energy generation, industrial energy generation facility in mind. And what you all, I think, are finding is that when all we ask for is low-cost power, when all we ask for is low-cost power, then all the energy companies and the solar developers are thinking about generally is just the photovoltaics, just the electrons, just the hardware. That can have negative land use implications. That can have negative implications with regards to the neighbors of those projects. So unfortunately, in this clean and green energy transition, we are seeing some negative trade-offs occasionally. So what we're hoping is that through more education and more informed innovation, as well as more informed procurement in what utilities are asking for and what corporate energy buyers are asking for, that more and more companies and states and counties are encouraging solar energy projects that are paired with conservation practices, stewardship practices. This is the photo that inspired all of our work, and from a site that inspired all of our work, West Mill Solar Park in the United Kingdom. This photo was taken in 2014, roughly, and we reached out to these developers and the ecologists and the landscapers to find out, what went wrong, how did it go right, what did you learn from it, and then brought those and imported those practices to the United Kingdom, or from the United Kingdom to the U.S. We were beat to the punch, I'm delighted to say, by Conexus Energy, the largest rural electric cooperative in the state of Minnesota. They had already seeded their 125 kilowatt array, or 245 kilowatt array in Ramsey, Minnesota, with a pollinator-friendly seed mix, and have been managing it to successfully establish this vegetation. So let's go to Conexus's site. Let's see. So I'm going to screen share. And desktop. So this is the Conexus Energy's headquarters, right? So back in 2014, it was economic for them to get started in solar, and they built this project, the 245 kilowatt system with a fence around the perimeter. And as I showed, let's see. This is this is a picture from that project. And the whole site just looks like this, right? So it's the first 2 years or so have this pop, this burst of black-eyed Susans. And then as the vegetation grows and matures over the years, there's more diversity. So the black-eyed Susans die back, and you'll see other species pop up. But we found the vegetation was absolutely thriving in the shade as well as in the full sun of the solar panels. Now, I do want to go back to, so that was kind of how Minnesota got started, was finding the West Mill Solar Project, hearing about that happening at scale, and then finding this one example on a small project done by an innovative cooperative here in Minnesota, and then saying, hey, let's bring these practices to scale. Those practices went into scale with the Enel Green Power Aurora project, as well as North Star Solar project immediately to its north. So I'm going to navigate back to those projects. So now you can see. So this is one of the 3 facilities we visited with Enel back in 2018. And I'm gonna go full screen. So you can see the thickness of the vegetation here. It's pretty sparse. This is the first growing season for this project array. Now, one thing I want to really highlight for this project, again, a 1,200 acre, 150 megawatt project over 16 sites, is a couple of key differentiators and key things that make it successful. But first off is the height of these panels. So, so these panels, you'll notice, are about 5 feet off the ground or more. You know, and throughout this tour, you'll notice that the lower edge of those panels is 36 inches, 40 inches, 44 inches. It's high enough to allow for a broad diversity of vegetation to thrive under and around the panels, but yet low enough that a construction worker can reach right up, and instead of working down like on a table, they work either at eye height or underneath to screw the systems in. So, you know, you do have a significant increase in labor cost as soon as you go to what's called solar canopy. So solar canopy is even higher than this, and that's going to require a lot more ladders, a lot more equipment on site. But in terms of getting the vegetation to be successful, you have to you know, work with the solar developers to get them to embrace the innovation of higher panels. And the challenge is that this is not easy for a lot of developers. Unfortunately, civil engineering is often siloed away from ecological services and marketing and PR. But as soon as civil engineering designs a system to be, say, 18 inches or 24 inches off the ground, that limits everything that everybody else can do. The reality is that the cost of additional steel to bring the panels from 24 inches to 36 inches is only around $400, $500 an acre, or around $3,000 per megawatt. So here's year one in the system. You see a lot of, you know, a lot of dandelions. This is our crew from Minnesota Native Landscapes, as well as the Department of Agriculture and Department of Commerce, getting a tour of the site, along with Soil and Water Conservation Society. Another innovation here that I think it's interesting to highlight is how the fence style does include 3 strands of barbed wire. You can see it up there. It does comply with electrical code requirements, but it is also significantly more cohesive with the rural character than a lot of typical chain link style fence. So this is what some people call a livestock style fence, or a woven wire fence, or a wildlife style fence. And again, significantly more compatible with rural character than prison style chain link fence. But also, it's basically equivalent in cost to doing it one versus the other. So you see folks walking around, taking some pictures. That's Jordan Macknick from the National Renewable Energy Lab, who is doing studies on these projects about the agricultural compatibility. And it's really young, right? You're not seeing a lot of biodiversity. They always talk about pollinator plantings, and that the first year they really grow down. Now, to ensure that you can close out your stormwater permit, developers need to be able to do that quickly. And so they're typically using a winter wheat or another cover crop to get that soil stabilization to ensure that they can meet their SWIP, they can close out their SWIP, but then, once they do the cover crop, then they're able to come back in and reseed with a pollinator-friendly seed mix. So this is a project that scores well. I believe it's 80 or 85 on Minnesota's pollinator-friendly solar scorecard. And yeah, first year, those dandelions are just right up. And that's pretty common throughout the site. So we do have some paper wasps. So if this is going to happen, no matter what, anytime you build anything, you're going to have paper wasps. I would not classically think of this as an insect that is at large is like a pollinator. A lot of wasps are predatory, but ultimately paper wasps are going to happen whether you have flowers around or not. And certainly the pollinator-friendly solar scorecard for the state of Michigan and for the state of Minnesota and other states allows developers to use controlled use of insecticides to control issues exactly like this. So whether you have a ground nesting yellow jacket wasps or paper wasps like pictured here, you can still control those to be able to manage the system effectively and efficiently. But the things that are nesting in here are not honeybees, right? They're not. There's no honey. Winnie the Pooh really cursed us when he trained us to think that there was honey inside hornets' nests. There's not. So there's Claire Lindahl from the Soil Water Conservation Society, and this is one of the Aurora sites down in Hastings. Again, first year. You can still see the straw that was used to stabilize the soil in addition to the cover crop. Just outside the fence, agriculture, typical traditional agriculture continues. Wildlife are also already enjoying, picking off the insects from this site, even though it just has dandelions on it today. This is a turkey that was walking around the perimeter and then ducked under the fence when it found a spot that was open and exited. This is one of the projects that happens to have a wildlife gap at the bottom edge of the fence. So let's see what happens a year later. Again, this is another Enel Green Power site. And this is a tour that included the Science Museum of Minnesota, several researchers, and others. There's Jake Jansky from Minnesota Native Landscapes. Their firm has just done a fantastic job in establishing vegetation throughout these projects. And in fact, I think at this time, they had already begun doing a grazing pilot. By this time now, this year, they actually have several million sheep hours logged in grazing solar farms, including this one. So you can see how the vegetation has changed from year one to year two. It really develops, it really comes on. You see the prairie coneflower here, the wild bergamot or bee balm, and a variety of other species, thriving. Now this is just one point in time. So at different times of the year, you're gonna see different things flowering in different levels of abundance. There's always going to be a mix, a healthy mix between the grasses and the flowering vegetation. We know, like landscape engineers and landscapers know that, a sustainable, stable meadow is usually somewhere between 60 and 80% grasses and 20 or more percent flowers. But it's never like replacing every blade of grass with a flower. It's always this kind of dotted environment. Also, something I'll point out is that, they say when managing meadows that often the first half inch, sometimes more, of the rain coming off of those panels never actually even touches the soil. It's caught up in the vegetation. So this landscape is not just, providing pollinator habitat, it's also providing important stormwater management functions that create an incredibly resilient landscape for the 30-year operating life of this facility. So you can see here how mowing on this particular project and in this row was done differently. They mowed just along the lower edge of the panels. Sites of, large scale solar sites are often set aside. They have to adapt to the contours of the land that they're on. And so you often have these open areas in solar farms. And, and that's just because of a variety of different modeling issues and contour issues. But again, looking at the success of this vegetation, this is absolutely what constitutes meaningful to pollinators within the managed landscape of a solar farm. Folks that are used to doing backyard gardening or other projects in closer proximity to the public might be used to seeing a lot more flowers. However, we have to really acknowledge that the first and foremost purpose for this facility is energy generation. But we know, and Anel knows, that we can all do a lot better than just mowing turf grass again and again and again. So you see the diversity, you see how the project adapts to the topography. And there's just lots of different kinds of flowering vegetation on this site. There's some swamp milkweed. Now, another year later, on a different site, we did a similar tour to this, except it was in person and distanced with the leadership of Pheasants Forever. And it was fantastic to hear from them about the qualities of vegetation that are important to pheasants. A lot of people don't know or realize, but a pheasant chick has to eat around 100 different bugs and insects every day for the first 6 weeks of life in order to have a reasonable chance of survival. So Pheasants Forever, they're not an organization that really cares at all about the structures, but they deeply care and are passionate and supportive of private sector investment in habitat. What they saw from this solar tour was habitat. They looked around, they saw the diverse mix of grasses, flowering plants, and said, yeah, in fact, while we were giving our introductory remarks at this facility, looking down the road that bisected the project, a group of about 12 turkeys wandered out and pecked at some of the gravel from the road and then moved along their way. So this is one of the rows. There's definitely some curation here in that, the photos that are beautiful are the photos that I'm like, wow, that's fantastic. There are other areas, other rows of the site where it's more diversity, greater abundance of grasses. This is one of the test plot sites that Anel is using to compare to the performance of the more grass dominated rows. But this mountain mint is absolutely loving the full sun as well as the full shade or the partial shade under and around the panels. You can see, so this kind of a landscape is much more typical and more common, where there's dots of color, and then the occasional area where there's an abundance of flowering plants. Despite the beauty of these landscapes, it's important to remember that this is not a full native or natural restoration. This is a landscape that's doing something meaningful and better than turf grass in successfully establishing a pollinator planting. So now I'm going to switch back to make some broader points. So what you just saw were photos from three different, actually four different pollinator-friendly solar arrays. This one by Conexus is tiny. You know, there are folks out there that think, oh, pollinator-friendly, that's perfect for those cute little solar projects, those distributed energy projects, those 2 megawatt, you know, projects or smaller. The reality is that pollinator-friendly solar is cheaper at scale because of the cost of mobilizing specialized equipment. Managing a large-scale site, 1,000 acres, 1,500 acres, more, is actually more cost-effective than doing it on these small projects. But that said, you know, there's just more and more projects, not just in Minnesota, but around the country. This one is in Vermont. They have numerous pollinator-friendly solar projects that are paired with beekeeping as well. This is the 1,000-acre North Star solar project, where they're, you know, when the day I visited, they were grazing 1,200 head of sheep and moving them around the project in a way that does regenerative grazing, where the sheep are obviously fertilizing the site, they're chewing down a lot of the vegetation in a focused way, and then they're actively moved to different parcels so that their hooves are trampling the seeds down into the ground, creating little pockets for water to collect. Another picture from yet another portion of the Aurora Solar Project site. The research happening by the National Renewable Energy Lab on these projects is invaluable. That project called Inspire is showing great results. Here's another example on one of those distributed projects. This is by NG Solar. Now, these practices absolutely scale up and very cost effectively. But you can see just 1 year later, from 2016 to 2017, and then 2 years later to 2019. So we know whether the vegetation is growing in the array or outside of the array or in the open area inside the fence, that we can do something that is better than just grass. And that's really what this innovation is all about. Now, it makes it a lot easier when corporations, utilities, and energy buyers specifically ask for this and encourage competition, not just on low price, but also on stewardship. But that said, there are plenty of counties that certainly welcome the investment that solar brings, but don't want to say yes without ensuring that there's stewardship of the land, particularly in states like Michigan. Michigan has such an incredible and highly diversified agricultural economy. So nearby in Denison University, also at the University of Dayton, they have a very, very charismatic site. You might think is more like a garden, and I wouldn't fault you for thinking that, but it is right in front of their alumni center. But I think maybe inspires some folks to think, how can you make solar look more than just green, but actually provide even more benefits. And just 2 years later, after talking about the conflict with solar, the Wall Street Journal is now covering solar as a potential bright spot. On the left here is the early stages of an NG pollinator-friendly solar farm adjacent to a soybean field. And it's not just the pollinators, of course, Charles mentioned, but it's also about those soils. So these deep-rooted plants will build organic matter under and around the array, in addition to benefiting the species that help agricultural crops and commodities. So also, I think functionally for solar developers, there's really exciting research happening so that you're not required to lease additional land to build stormwater containment basins, but that there's more data showing that actually the deep-rooted vegetation is managing the stormwater just fine. And so you shouldn't have to have stormwater containment basins as part of a solar array when it's pollinator friendly. The Inspire project I mentioned before, lots of exciting innovation, including how thicker vegetation under and around the panels helps mitigate the negative effects of heat. And particularly after such a weekend we have, and then the next several days of solar in the West, there is extreme heat in our future. And so we need to be thinking more and more innovatively about how we're going to help mitigate that negative effect of that heat. And we're finding that vegetation, because it transpires water, it can create a cooler microclimate that helps cool the panels. So pollinator-friendly solar can benefit crops, all of these different pollinator-friendly crops in a variety of different states. Michigan, just a giant leader in blueberries and cucumbers, both highly pollinator-dependent crops. But actually, Michigan has the second most diversified agricultural economy after the state of California. There's just so many delicious things that come from Michigan. So they all depend on pollinators, though. So definitely help a farmer out and increase the abundance of pollinator-friendly landscapes. The context for the pollinator-friendly solar scorecards in Michigan and so many other states is really at this crux of this question about what constitutes incremental versus meaningful. It is absolutely true that you can build a 1-acre pollinator garden in front of your 1,000-acre turf grass solar farm. It's just that we hate to see that happen, where a company is spending 10 times more dollars on the marketing than they are on the actual seed mix and the habitat. So it's important that we, as a solar industry, that we embrace, innovation and think about all of the seed mixes on our sites. This really does go back fundamentally to engaging our civil engineers to get them to put the panels up at 36 inches or higher. Still cost effective, still easy to construct, but gives the farmers and the community a lot more opportunity to realize the co-benefits. So more and more policies are encouraging pollinator-friendly development. Michigan, as you mentioned, Charles, has a requirement on ag reserve land for pollinator-friendly solar. And the cost question is really been described to me as budget dust, right? So in the course of a several $100 million solar project, the cost difference between pollinator friendly and not pollinator friendly is less than 0.1% of the total project budget. And there might be co-benefits that help offset all those costs, the cooling the panels, the operational efficiency, less mowing, etc. So a lot of the benefits we've talked about, but I also want to come back to agriculture, Charles. I know that a lot of the folks on the line today are really concerned about agricultural innovations. Specialty crops are a key portion of that, but also for the larger projects, for the 100 megawatt, 200 megawatt projects, we have to think in the mindset of rangeland almost. And so what can be done on solar projects that are huge is certainly pollinator-friendly vegetation and honeybees. So honeybees located outside the fence can create an agricultural product, from the vegetation and really benefit. So this is Tom Peterson, the commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, opening up a first frame of solar-grown honey. Some of this was going into beers and ciders that were being created. And it's just a fantastic opportunity for delicious specialty crop. Cliff Bar and Company, they're promoting solar-grown honey, and they have paired pollinator-friendly solar farms with honey production on their facilities. And we have a set of best practices. I want to go back again, though, to make sure that if you liked what you saw today, if you're an energy buyer, that you put this in your procurement. If you're a state agency, that the state look at its default standard contracts so that when the state is looking to power its buildings, it can ask for pollinator-friendly solar, just the way Cliff Bar and Organic Valley did. If you're a utility, that you're encouraging, the folks that are competing in your procurement process and requiring a pollinator-friendly solar scorecard in that procurement. In fact, it's not just Connexus that's doing this. It's one of the largest utilities in the country. Xcel Energy is requiring a pollinator-friendly solar scorecard for every bid into their competitive RFP process. So more and more companies, universities, and cities are doing this. It's a very, easy thing to do to unlock innovation, unleash the competitive landscape, and really benefit consumers, so that we get these two things together more and more often. So we'll go to questions. Charles, thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you all for your time. We'll take the questions.
Rob, wonderful. Thank you very much. So we have a question here that says, we see a lot of our energy clients have transitioned to single axis tractors. These sit closer to the ground than fixed panels. We have been told by clients that elevating the panels can add millions of dollars to the projects, making them unfeasible. What recommendations do you have to create low profile pollinator friendly mixes? And then he has in parentheses up to 2 feet in height.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time to be learning about this, and I have to share, it's hard. The reality is that every solar developer that I've ever met has a list of about 1 million projects that they're trying to get done all by tomorrow, and somewhere off of that page, on the next page, is a list of things that they'd like to do, but maybe they won't do, and that's rethink the seed mix. Or think about something differently about the seed mix. The reality is that more and more corporations are putting their panels at 36 inches, 40 inches, 44 inches, and that's just where the market is moving. For folks that are saying, "Oh, we can't do it," the answer is your competitors are already doing it. So, if you need more bids, then maybe you need more bids.
Thank you, Rob. Next question. Do you need to use species that are shade tolerant under the solar panels, or could you just use the same prairie species under the panels as you would around the panels?
Yeah, all of the sites you saw today in this tour, there was one seed mix in the entire array area. So the vegetation thrives. Another thing that I'll share about having those panels up at 40 inches is that you get more indirect light under the panels, and that allows for better vegetation establishment. When the panels are down low at 24 inches or 18 inches, they're very shaded. It's a deep shadow. And so you have less successful vegetation establishment, and you have more mowing, which is like double negative. So again, higher panels for better establishment under the array. Then it gives you more flexibility for lower cost seed mixes throughout the project.
So Keith is making a comment here. He says dandelions are beneficial for pollinators, especially bees, because early spring flowering and are composite flowers. Oh, and they're early spring flowering and composite flowers. Bee hotels could also be added for cavitated bees, and there should be bare soil areas for digger minor native bees. Any comments to Keith's point?
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with dandelions. I agree. We should leave them in our yard. And frankly, we should probably do something better than just dandelions in our yard anyway. I think that what happens with a pollinator-friendly planting is that the first things that flower, are just those fast-growing weed species. So we do need to be thoughtful about hiring, experienced landscape practitioners who know how to successfully establish a meadow and know whether they should be concerned about dandelions, or frankly, know how to recognize the difference between a bull thistle and something else. So they're not just going in there with a mower and spreading 400,000, bull thistle seeds all around your solar project, tracking the seeds into the mower's, treads and bringing them to your next project. So weed management is absolutely important, and it's better within a solar farm than on CRP because there's a landscape management contract and ideally an experienced landscape contractor to manage those projects.
Sue asks, is there any material at the drip line of the panels to help with the rainfall off the panel? So
the PV Smart research study being led by the National Renewable Energy Lab has some very interesting and optimistic data about the hydrology of solar facilities, and that That hasn't been published yet, but it is forthcoming. And it's not just one drip line. That was something that was a really interesting insight, was that because there's generally spacing of a centimeter or a half inch between some of the panels, you're actually seeing multiple drip lines. And then, you know, for the folks that aren't in the solar industry, there's two different configurations. There's, you know, single axis tracker where it just faces south. Excuse me. There's fixed array where it just faces south. The rows are east-west. And then, and there's one drip line with the gaps as well. So there's the gap drip line and then the edge drip line. And then separately, there's the single axis tractors. Those face north-south. In the morning, they face east. And then throughout the day, they tip to the west. So those have multiple drip lines. So it's not like there's just one deluge point. There are multiple places where that rainwater is diffused. But I do expect there to be more and more innovation. Right now, as you can see from the picture behind this, you know, in this slide, there's not any like, you know, mesh material or anything like that that might degrade over time, or maybe it cause plastic pollution or something like that that I've seen. And I have seen that some developers or some counties like require developers to put rows of gravel at the drip line, and that's just a terrible idea. Bringing gravel and rocks that, you know, could break and shatter a solar project into a facility is just a terrible idea. You know, we really need to be thoughtfully using those resources to get better vegetation, so the vegetation can control that stormwater.
Thank you, Rob. David asked, how frequently does heavy equipment or construction work take place within these solar arrays? Any concern of damage from planned or unplanned maintenance?
It happens, no question. Anytime mowers come inside the fence, there is a risk. So, I mean, particularly for those projects where the panels are at 12 inches, 18 inches, or 24 inches. So, you know, you've got the mowers that are coming down the panels, the rows, and usually that's a tractor. And then there's a swing arm behind the mower. Then hopefully the swing arm is going underneath the panels to get that vegetation. So it's that swing arm when it's going under the edge of the row that if it hits a bump, it can cause damage. But generally, aside from a mower, you're not seeing, you know, other equipment go into solar facilities, except maybe in the desert Southwest. They bring water trucks in to wash the dust. It's the sunniest place in the country, but it's also the dustiest place. So there's a lot of water trucks that come in to wash the panels. But we haven't seen that, you know, in states like Minnesota and Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, because we get enough rain.
So an anonymous attendee asked this question. So can the solar installation make money from sheep grazing leases versus spending money for mowing?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, that's the only, I guess, you know, a better way to put this is we are cursed a little bit in that we have to deal with the environment, the society that we have. And today, there are millions of mowers and people with pickup trucks and willing to drive to a solar project and do it for cheap, cheap, cheap. And unfortunately, that, you know, that has caused a variety of short-term decisions that add up to a lot of cost. You know, when one mow only costs $50 an acre or $100 an acre, then the developer is just going to do that again and again and again, 6-8 times a year. But absolutely, you know, there are more and more places where there are a couple hundred, you know, a couple thousand head of sheep that can do regenerative grazing on solar projects. A huge, huge shout out to the folks at Cornell that are doing science and doing research on the compatibility of rotational grazing with pollinator habitat. The Ernst Conservation Seeds has actually developed what they call a fuzz and buzz mix. So that's the sheep and the bees. And so you can absolutely get your fuzz and buzz on. You know, all you need though is the sheep. So, you know, for folks that are thinking, how do I get an edge? I would definitely look at co-locating sheep and solar and find some nearby sheep farmers or folks with experience. It's being done at scale, though. Even in northern Georgia, Facebook, Silicon Ranch is doing regenerative grazing on 1,500 acres for Facebook. So it's not just Minnesota, just New York, just Georgia. It's a big trend.
So we have interest in that here in Michigan, and I'm going to be putting together a similar type of webinar slash virtual field day where we'll be addressing Michigan-specific issues in raising sheep in solar projects. So I'm anticipating doing that in January. So those of you on from Michigan, be looking for that.
A huge shout out, Charles, to Lexi Hain and the American Solar Grazing Association.
Yeah.
They've just done a fantastic job of helping, I think, all of us know, in a variety of states, that these two things of conservation and grazing can absolutely go together. The sheep and the bees can get along and thrive, particularly on these large scale projects. Smaller projects might be more suited for specialty agriculture, or you could have specialty agriculture just outside the fence, where tomatoes and pollinator dependent crops would thrive. But certainly in terms of large scale land management, sheep are an innovative and exciting frontier.
Yep. And the nice thing about it here in Michigan, we've got market for sheep. So that's what's really exciting. All right, Sue asks, what is used for, quote, mid-management of the plantings? Chemical treatment or chemical treatment and reseeding, question mark?
Usually, in an ideal situation, the solar project is going into a Roundup ready field. So, you definitely need to, the developer and the landscape consultants definitely need to understand what herbicides have been used in the past on those projects so that they understand, when is the right time to be doing a pollinator seeding. It's been described to me by, the experts at Pollinator Partnership, the experts at Xerxes Society for Invertebrates, is, you're going to be a lot more successful establishing a pollinator friendly meadow if you terminate turf grass or if you terminate existing pasture and then reseed with a pollinator, a cover crop, and then a pollinator seed mix. There's a variety of different ways to do it. And even if you have to retrofit, where you like have a solar farm that has turf grass or is overgrown with something else, it's just vegetation, right? So President Carter terminated the overgrown buffalo grass on his solar farm in Plains, Georgia, reseeded it to be pollinator friendly. Purdue Farms in Salisbury, Maryland, terminated the turf grass on their solar farm, reseeded to be pollinator friendly. So there's a great organization called Conservation Blueprint. I think he's presented with MSU in the past, Pete Berthelsen. He's just a fantastic resource for balancing the challenges that construction and pollinators and successful low-cost maintenance have. So I hope that's certainly a long, extended answer to your question, Sue, and I appreciate it.
You kind of answered this question, but let's circle back around to it. Does it make sense to use one seed mix with a variety of species, knowing that some species will do better under the drip edge, some in the shadier areas, and some in full sun? You had commented that on that one site that it was a single mix planted over the whole area.
Yeah, and I should amend that. So because I know there are several projects that are, large scale projects, have different soil types and soil conditions, and it's likely, right? It's likely that on a 1,000 acre or 2,000 acre solar project that's going into farm field, you're going to discover that you have areas that that use drain tile, and if you puncture a hole in that drain tile, well, now you suddenly have like a miniature wetland swampy area. So there may be spots within a large scale facility where you have sandy, loamy, or even wet soil, or even clay soils. So you definitely have to adapt the seed mix to the soil, but I haven't seen any projects to date where they've been adapting the seed mix for the drip edge, for the shade, and for the full sun. That would require a level of cost that I haven't seen anybody get too excited about yet.
So Rob, I've got a comment and then I think a final question here. Michelle says, Rob, you need master gardeners like myself who love green energy and understand IPM.
Yeah, you know, I'll also just share like one of my, this is a very nerdy thing, but there's a guy out there named Rick Johnstone, who's in my view, he's like the John Wayne of integrated vegetation management, because he has a career built on 20 years of managing right-of-ways for large-scale utilities. So he's all about like, hey, if you're mowing, it's not management. You want to successfully establish a transmission right-of-way so that you almost never have to mow, and the species crowd out the weed trees. Within distribution networks and transmission networks, you have very negative consequences when trees grow up and touch the transmission or distribution lines. So Rick has done just a fantastic job of helping the transmission right-of-way industry know and share best practices about how to successfully do integrated vegetation management.
So here's our final question here. Janine says, in our experience, the cost of steel plus additional engineering, safety, and larger racking can cost upward to $50 per, or 50K, yeah, 50,000 per megawatt. Did the power purchaser subsidize the cost of increasing panel height to allow vegetative growth? If a developer had to absorb this cost, it would likely result in project no longer being financially viable.
Yeah, that's definitely, hi Janine, and thanks for your question. That's definitely anomalous from everything I've heard from other solar developers and racking companies. So Nextracker and other major racking providers, I'm not hearing anything about significant cost impact for the additional steel to move that rack from 24 inches to 36 or 40 inches, and certainly never heard anything in the range of 50K per megawatt. What I heard was by two different civil engineers from two different companies, one small, one global, was the napkin math exercise of around $3,000 per megawatt per foot. So $3,000 per megawatt per foot, so yeah, let's absolutely, go back to our suppliers and say, hey, other people are getting great deals. We want the same deal. And let's incite some education and innovation and competition. It would be very exciting for you guys to get exactly the same deal that other folks are getting.
So Rob, that's the end of our questions here. Want to thank you sincerely for what you shared. That was an excellent virtual tour. What I had hoped is that people would get a visual picture of what a solar habitat would look like. And I think you've accomplished that. You've brought other pertinent information into the discussion. And I think that's going to give everyone an opportunity to some things to chew on. So thanks again for being our content expert today, and just want to remind all of you who are on that when you log off, there will be a survey that will pop up. Please complete the survey and give us your feedback.
Charles probably can't instruct you to give a very positive review, but for Charles' portion, he was amazing. And I just put a plug in that he's one of the hardest working, most effective educators and extension agents I've had the pleasure of working with. So, please give him high remarks, maybe separate from what you might or may not have learned from me. But I'm so grateful for the time and all of your, consideration and questions on all this, and look forward to building better and better and better solar projects with you, Charles, and with you all on the line. well into the future.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, well, this concludes the webinar, and we'll see you for the last segment next Tuesday at noon.